Welcome. This is Progressive Education, and what I hope to do here is give you a little background and do it with audio file as a progressive type of methodology. So first of all, you should know that one of the pioneers of progressive education goes way back into the late 1800s, Francis Parker. His statement is rather interesting. He says that all mental and moral development is by self-activity. Education is the economizing of self-effort in the direction of all-sided development. So very early on, he used this term development, and he positioned this statement in a manner which indicated how schools were evolving and what he aspired for them to be. It's important for you to understand that we use this word progressive for a reason. It emerged in a period of time where there was just rapid change and science and technology leading the way. So at the heart of progressivism, at least as it is imagined and implemented in schools, is this idea that using science and technology can create literally a utopia, that there's a reason why we have schools, and that is to essentially help students to become versed in using technology and also in understanding the world using a scientific lens. And the biggest proponents of this thought that this is how we make schools efficient. This is a period of time, this progressive era, when industry and factories grow like mushrooms and our country, the United States of America, becomes fully involved in moving from an agrarian society into an industrial one. So you will have many calls from the owners of the factories and from administrators within the factories arguing for more vocational education. In other words, training workers. Of course, workers had their own ideas about what type of education they needed, what they wanted, and as the factories grew and as workers were put to the task of creating ever more widgets, whether those are furniture or cars or all other types of implements, they also wanted to have an education, and they naturally wanted to better themselves, if they even thought that that was possible. So this also led to considerations about working conditions. Factory work is very, very rigorous and oftentimes unsafe, and oftentimes workers can be exploited. Hence, there was a rising at the same time of unions that were initially put together by people like Margaret Haley in order to get better pay, for example, for teachers who worked in schools that had factory-like conditions. My own sense of progressive education is that it really begs the question of what type of curriculum and what do we mean by curriculum, and what are some ideas behind curriculum that we theorize about as we go about putting together the lesson and as we go about teaching and learning. So to me, the progressive education period brings all those questions around curriculum. Hence, it's really about curriculum theory, and I think that is what makes it a very dynamic period. So John Dewey receives, rightly so, a lot of credit as one of our more established and early philosophers of education. And he was that. He thought deeply and broadly about education, and in fact thought deeply and broadly about democracy, which makes him very interesting. His books span school and society, democracy and education, and the like. And there were different types of ideas around progressive education that we'll focus on that emerged during his life that he either had some involvement with or was responding to. That's why he's important, and that's why these schools of thought are also important. The first is social efficiency, And this is an important philosophy or school of thought that happens during the progressive education era because of the rise of industry, which we just talked about earlier slide. And the idea would be that there are ways to make schools efficient, much like the factory line. This was embraced, by the way, by many political parties, that the factory and the assembly line and the way to break down tasks would be the way that schools should go, or should be the way that schools should go. So there was a great deal of interest in this idea, and it brings up metaphors about the school as a factory, teachers as workers, and students as products. Some ideas, by the way, that we might find objectionable even today, because students clearly are more than just products. The next school of thought is developmental psychology, and this type of thought is very embedded in much of the education work that you'll probably be receiving in your methods courses. But the general idea is that the student goes through different developmental stages. Now, more explicitly controversial back in this period of time, which was really the 1910s, 1920s, was the idea of students being assigned different levels and segregated according to intelligence quotient. It's really an open question if we continue to do that practice. In theory, most educators would say that's not what we want to do. We want to be more inclusive by contemporary standards today. So the third school of thought really has to do with social change, or what was called social meliorism, essentially to ameliorate conditions that are problematic. And this really emerged from several sociologists at the turn of the century, in the 1900s and thereabouts. Frank Ward gets some credit as a social reformer who coined the ideas of education for bettering the social conditions. And the assumption really is, again, very utopian in nature, as are all three of these schools of thought, that a better society can be created when students are nurtured and supported to be future leaders. So this is the last of the slides that I'll use the audio for this digital presentation. The general idea here is to think about what are the constants that inform curriculum and pedagogy. And pedagogy is just another word for instruction of children, and more. It really has to do with how to appreciate the child as an individual and all of the things that accrue from that. The little graph, or the little model here about curriculum, content, pedagogy, and learning is intended to show that much of this is very dependent on crossing different boundaries and interdisciplinarity, subject matter, and how that changes often your pedagogy, and the world around us informs how children learn.